It's 4 hours GMT. I'm Regid Ahmed, and coming up in this edition of the Newsroom, it's a distraction from his failing policies. Democrat congresswomen fire back at Donald Trump over his tweets and accusations.
This is the agenda of white nationalists. He does not know how to defend his policies, so what he does is attack us personally.
Meanwhile, what do changes to the president's much-maligned immigration law mean for asylum seekers arriving from Mexico? Also in the programme, we hear about the devastation monsoon rains are bringing to South Asia.
It's a very dry, dusty environment. Add water onto that, the ground soon moves, people's homes soon move, and people there have been killed.
The incredible story of separating conjoined twins, and 50 years ago, Apollo 11 took off on its mission to the moon. What are humanity's plans to go back?
We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return.
That's all coming up.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. The Democratic Congresswomen accused that price. BBC News.
You're listening to the Newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Regid Ahmed. The issue of race is once again dominating American politics. The latest row began when President Trump accused 4 Democratic congresswomen of loving America's enemies and said that if they weren't happy in the US, then they should leave. His tweets have been widely condemned as racist. Now the 4 congresswomen have hit back, accusing the president of human rights abuses, racism and xenophobia, and of running the most corrupt administration in history. They held a joint news conference in Washington on Monday afternoon. This is one of them, Ilhan Omar.
This is a president who has equated neo-Nazis with those who protest against them in Charlottesville. This is a president who has openly violated the very value our country aspires to uphold. And to distract from that, he's launching a blatantly racist attack on 4 duly elected members of the United States House of Representatives, all of whom are women of color. This is the agenda of white nationalists, whether it is happening in chat rooms or it's happening on national TV, and now it's reached the White House garden.
Another of the Congresswomen, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, struck a defiant note as she said the president was trying to deflect attention from his policies, especially those that saw immigrant children locked up near the US border.
This president does not know how to make the argument that Americans do not deserve health care. He does not know how to defend his policies. So what he does is attack us personally. And that is what this is all about. He can't look a child in the face, and he can't look all Americans in the face and justify why this country is throwing them in cages. So instead, he tells us that I should go back to the great borough of the Bronx and make it better. And that's what I'm here to do.
Well, David Willis is our correspondent in Washington. I asked him why, in particular, the women had accused President Trump of trying to distract attention from criticism of his own policies.
Regid, I think it's a distraction, they think, from issues such as immigration reform, a subject on which these 4 women hold strong views. They object to the deportation of migrant families who are seeking asylum here, and they want, so one of them, Ayanna Pressley, said at that press conference today, to take action in regard to the high price of prescription drugs in America, to address the wealth gap here, and they believe that President Trump is adopting this sort of rhetoric because he can't find a way of tackling those issues. So he needs a distraction from that, they believe.
Now, what response have we heard from Republicans? Have been a little bit muted.
Well, as far as the Republicans are concerned, we have seen some pushback, but it has been slow. You're absolutely right. Senator Susan Collins, she's a moderate Republican, called for President Trump to take those tweets down, the tweets that he put up yesterday, while Senator Tim Scott and Congressman Will Hurd, they are the only Republican African-Americans on the Senate and House floors, respectively, have condemned the president's tweets as racist. But from the Republican leadership itself, Regid, we have heard nothing. Nothing from Kevin McCarthy, nothing from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
And just briefly, what does this mean for Donald Trump's popularity?
Well, I think it's an attempt by President Trump to frame next year's election as a choice between an American-loving, pro-capitalist president and a Democratic Party beholden to fringe socialists, if you like, people who, in his words, hate the United States. The problem is there are even those in his own party, as I mentioned, who aren't buying it.
Well, as we heard from David Willis, the issue of immigration is another big political issue in the US. And later on Tuesday, the White House is due to introduce a new asylum law which will deny people from Central America the right to claim asylum in the US if they've already passed through another country without applying. But Mexico has criticised the proposed changes. Our correspondent in the region, Will Grant, told me more.
Well, the very basic idea is that the way that Trump administration wants to prevent the same degree of migration from Central America is by saying that those migrants who fail to apply for asylum in the very first country they pass through on their way to the US will therefore be ineligible for asylum in the US. What does that mean? If you're coming from Honduras, if you're coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, those three countries that are considered the Northern Triangle in Central America, then you're passing through Mexico en route to the US. Just by geography, that's the way you have to get there. They're saying that you'll have to apply for Mexico, and if you fail to, there's no way you're going to get asylum in the US. The implications are huge. Already, for the many, many thousands of families that are already at the border were waiting and didn't cross illegally because they thought they had a shot at an asylum claim.
Now, this type of agreement has been tried with Guatemala. What happened there?
Well, the Guatemalan court sort of overturned the fact that Guatemala would be considered what's called a safe third country, largely because, let's face it, Guatemala isn't safe. If you're fleeing violence in Honduras, in El Salvador, the conditions in Guatemala are almost identical. So the idea of returning people or forcing people to stay in Guatemala while they wait for their asylum claims to be processed in the United States would bring the real threat of violence, the real threat of exactly the same conditions people are leaving in the first place.
Our Central American correspondent, Will Grant. The European Parliament is due to vote today on whether to confirm a close ally of the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, as the next president of the European Commission. If MEPs reject Ursula von der Leyen as the replacement for Jean-Claude Juncker, it could spark a fresh bout of political agonising in the EU, as Damien Grammaticus reports from Strasbourg.
Ursula von der Leyen's was a surprise nomination by EU leaders. If confirmed, she'll be the first woman to be president of the European Commission. But she needs at least half of the votes of the 750 MEPs in the European Parliament, and it's not clear if she'll get them. A German conservative close to Angela Merkel, she's supported by centre-right MEPs, but many on the left, along with Greens, are opposed to her. Socialists are angry that EU presidents and prime ministers rejected the lead socialist candidate from the European elections and, after a backroom deal, proposed Ms von der Leyen, currently Germany's defence minister, instead. To try to win left-wing votes, she's promised the EU, under her direction, will legislate for a minimum wage and for gender quotas on company boards. To attract Greens, she said the EU should do more to reduce carbon emissions. To attract Liberal votes, she's promising protections for the rights of refugees and tougher monitoring to ensure countries like Hungary and Poland comply with EU democratic values. But those policies may cost her votes among Eurosceptic and hard right-wing parties. If Ms von der Leyen is rejected, the EU will face a new period of deep political uncertainty.
Damien Grammaticus. A monsoon season has begun in South Asia and it's wreaking havoc across parts of the region. Millions have been displaced and more than 150 people have died in flooding in India, Nepal and Bangladesh. Earlier I spoke to our reporter, Gareth Barlow. He gave us a picture of the situation.
Let's go through some of the facts and figures. They give the best insight of the scale and the devastation involved here. In Bangladesh, 7 people died when their ferry sunk in the Bay of Bengal. 18 people have been killed by lightning. In Nepal, at least 67 people have been killed there by torrential rain. And in one state in India alone, the Reuters news agency reports that at least 1,800 villages have been swamped by water. And across the region, like you say, at least 130 people killed, over 3 million people displaced. And this is all at the hands of the annual monsoon that runs between June and September. To give a slight sense of context, last year in parts of India, it was the largest and most widespread flooding for at least a century there. Let's hear from one of the people that's been impacted by this year's floods.
For 4 days there have been floods. We did not get any relief or tarpaulin sheets. We are drinking the water from the river. We asked the government to give us relief materials so that we will survive. All of us are staying on this embankment with goats and cattle.
Now, there is particular concern for Rohingya refugees who are in Bangladesh.
Yes, there's still around 1 million people who have fled from Myanmar. They live in temporary camps still made out of bamboo and tarpaulin. There isn't many permanent structures there. And since April, there have been hundreds of landslides amongst these terraced hillsides. Most of the area where the Rohingya refugees are living used to be woodland. That's all been deforested, either to make the camps or for firewood for burning. I went there a couple of years ago myself, and it's a very dry, dusty environment. Add water onto that, the ground soon moves, people's homes soon move, and people there have been killed as well.
Just very briefly, what help are people getting?
The military have been mobilised in India. Obviously, this is an annual event, so the authorities know how to respond. But like we say, the scale is just huge. And we've heard from that gentleman there saying they're not getting enough aid. They're not getting the tarpaulin. They're having to drink from these dirty, fetid rivers, which, of course, will be becoming contaminated and polluted by all this floodwater. But paramilitary have been mobilised, the military, and also airborne rescue as well. So help is on hand, but it's a huge, huge issue to deal with.
Our reporter Gareth Barlow there. Now to a remarkable medical story. Surgeons at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London have successfully separated twin girls who were born joined at the head. The condition of Safa and Marwa, who are 2 years old and from Pakistan, was so complex they had to undergo 3 lengthy operations. Our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh was given exclusive access to their story.
So we have one case for the list today. Safa and Marwa, 2 kids, 1 case.
Safa and Marwa were born joined at the top of their skull, which was one long tube. They had separate brains, but these were fused together. The surgery was complex and risky. The team at Great Ormond Street decided it would need 3 operations over several months. Professor David Dunaway is one of the lead surgeons.
Clearly, I think life being separate is better than being joined together. If we felt that there wasn't a very, very high chance that we could do it safely, we'd be thinking quite carefully about whether we should do it or not. And I think the whole team feel that there's an excellent chance of a successful separation here.
The first 2 operations in October and November, lasting a total of 35 hours, dealt with dividing the labyrinth of shared blood vessels that crisscrossed from one twin's brain to the other.
So the artery from Safa going to supply Marwa's brain has been clamped.
It took several months for the girls to recover from that, so it wasn't until February that the operation to separate them could finally go ahead.
So this is Safa's brain, that's Marwa's brain. Yeah. So the sheet should be running like this,
This took 17 hours and involved surgeons building a top to each girl's head using pieces of bone removed from the shared skull. Safa and Marwa, now separated, needed intensive physiotherapy to build their muscle strength, and it was only earlier this month that they were finally discharged from hospital. The gruelling surgery took its toll. The girls, now 2.5, are likely to have learning difficulties. But their mother told us she was delighted she could finally hold each twin separately in her arms.
Let's just remind you of our main headlines. 4 US Congresswomen branded anti-American by President Trump have accused him of using the row to distract from failing policies. And the UN Refugee Agency has said a new tougher asylum rule being introduced by the United States breaks international law. BBC World Service. Evelyn Hernandez says her only crime was to have been raped, then suffer a miscarriage. But in 2017, she was convicted by the authorities in El Salvador of having had an abortion in defiance of the country's strict laws. She appealed against her 30-year sentence and was released last December, but now she faces a retrial in a move that sparked outrage among women's groups in the deeply Catholic country. Our Latin America editor Leonardo Rocha has more.
They decided to start a new trial again with new evidence. There's forensic evidence of the remains of the fetus that they found and all sorts of things. And what she's saying is that she's innocent. She said she was raped by a gang member when she was 17. She didn't know, she didn't realize she was pregnant, and she lost the baby in the early stages of pregnancy, and she didn't even breach the El Salvador's strict abortion laws. Abortion is not allowed in any circumstance in El Salvador. There are about 20 women in jail for the same offense. And they're outside the court today in the outskirts of the capital, San Salvador. There were many people protesting and saying free the other women who are in jail. There's a big stigma. Evelyn Hernandez said she felt very scared in jail. She went through a lot of very scary situations in prison, and she says she's completely innocent. So there have been appeals for the law to be changed. The government said it would change in some way the legislation, and it's yet to be seen, because she might be at the end of this trial or during the hearing, the court might decide that she'll have to go back to jail.
Leonardo Rocha. To the Democratic Republic of Congo now, where efforts to contain the spread of an Ebola outbreak are stepping up after the first case of the virus was identified in the city of Goma when a pastor there tested positive for the disease. The city lies on the border with Rwanda. More than 1,600 people have died in the DRC since the Ebola outbreak began a year ago. The BBC's Gaius Kawene has been following developments.
So what has been going on in the past few hours is that first there is the Rwandan Minister of Health who visited the border between DRC and Rwanda in Gisenyi to inspect implementation of measures that were put in place to prevent the Ebola disease from crossing to the Rwandan side. However, on the Congolese side now, what happened is that the first case of Ebola detected in the town of Goma was transferred to Butembo in a biosafe chamber. That's some sort of special ambulance, and they use the road. It's a long road that's not well maintained, and we are hearing reports from official sources that actually this pastor may have died, and it is something that we will try to confirm. As the other thing is also that some of people who shared the bus ride with him when the pastor was traveling from Tembo to Goma, 18 people shared the bus ride with him. There is also the family that welcomed him. Some of these people who were in contact with him have already been vaccinated. Most of them have been identified, and now the rest of the work remains like finding all of them. However, also the other thing is that in the town of Goma, people have already started reinforcing now measures. There are places where, for example, people did not have hand washing stations, but now people are using buckets, have a bucket and then some soap, just so that you can wash your hands before, for example, entering into an office or entering into a compound. So even people now have become more conscious of the danger that Ebola represents, because they used to hear about Ebola from very far in the eastern part, in Beni and Tembo. However, now they heard that first case in Goma.
Gaius Kawene. And now Chris has some other stories from our news desk.
Newly released figures from Japan show that nearly 600 young people under the age of 20 took their own lives last year. The figure has remained largely unchanged for the past 2 decades, despite a fall in the overall number of suicides in Japan in recent years. A third of the deaths were prompted by school-related problems. A US judge has cut the damages awarded to a man who said his cancer was caused by the weed killer Roundup. The judge ruled that the overall award against Bayer and its subsidiary Monsanto should be slashed from $80 million to $25 million. The company insists that the weed killer is safe. And a street in Wales has been declared the steepest in the world. Wish me luck, Regid. It's called Fourth Pen Chlech in the northwestern town of Harlech. It was crowned the winner with a gradient of 37.45%. The title was previously held by Baldwin Street in the New Zealand city Dunedin. Residents in Fourth Pen Chlech have long campaigned for the Guinness World Record title. They're planning a party to celebrate the accolade.
Very well. Now, events will take place around the world today to mark 50 years since NASA sent the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. The commemorations, including a live broadcast reuniting the astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, will focus on the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the rocket blasted off on July the 16th. 1969. The last manned mission to the moon was in 1972, but that could be about to change. Tom Fielden has more.
We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return.
Gene Cernan, the last man to set foot on the surface of the moon, bids an emotional farewell on the lunar surface as the crew of Apollo 17 prepare to return to Earth. At the time, and even though the Apollo era was at an end, it was widely assumed we would soon be back.
Rather than lead in space, too often we've chosen to drift.
But that was 47 years ago.
When we drift, we fall behind.
50 years, Vice President Mike Pence reminded members of the National Space Council in March, since that first small step.
In the debate that followed, sending Americans to the moon was treated as a triumph to be remembered, but not repeated.
But now, really for the first time since the Apollo era came to an end, there's a comprehensive plan to go back to the moon and beyond.
We will return American astronauts to the moon, not only to leave behind footprints and flags, but to build the foundation we need to send Americans to Mars and beyond.
That plan is Artemis, aptly named after the twin sister of Apollo and goddess of the moon, and it is much more than a footprints and flags dash. NASA's Stuart McClung.
I like to think of it as an enabler, right? We'll get back to the moon. We will set the stage for even further exploration. And so it's not just get out there. It's get out and use and prove and then build off of that.
And building in space is a key element in the Artemis program. Jennifer Lopez is a former technology lead on the International Space Station and founder of NASA's Datanaut Corps.
The first 3D printer was launched to the space station about 4 or 5 years ago. So starting with that as the baseline and now looking at using a regolith, which is the material on the surface of the moon, and integrating that into these new structures. The long-term goals are to essentially build full habitats or large structures in space.
So if I'm now in control of the robot...
Aiding and abetting humanity as we build our way out into the solar system will be a fleet of robotic and semi-autonomous landers, rovers and scientific instruments and devices.
So it would do exactly the same thing.
At the European Space Agency's Human Robotic Interaction Laboratory near Amsterdam, Thomas Kruger's designing a wearable exoskeleton that could one day control a robotic explorer on the surface of a distant world.
In our scenario, the astronauts orbit the planet, we send the robots down, and the robot would mimic my movement. You see?
So you swing your arm forwards and backwards, you lift up and down, you reach out to pick something up.
Indeed.
And on the planet below, the robot is going to do the
Yes.
same thing.
Yes, it does the same thing.
And because this is no longer a bipolar geopolitical race, he says James Carpenter believes it will be a global effort for all mankind.
There are countries investing, agencies investing, the private sector investing, new rationales emerging. And so right now is really a critical point. It's the point where we as a species become a spacefaring species. It is starting and it's happening now.
Our science editor Tom Fielden, and of course so much more on the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, including special web stories and podcasts. That's all at bbc.com/news and bbcworldservice.com. You've been listening to the Newsroom.